Times Radio with Matt Chorely.
Let's stick with global affairs. There's obviously lots of talk about aiming to be a global Britain, we're told, after leaving the EU. You've got Liz Truss out and about chasing trade deals. And our measure of our success of Brexit is how much global trade we're doing. But let's step back for a minute. Let's talk about globalisation. Is this the best way to run the world? And ultimately, is it working and can it succeed? Well, it's the topic of a new book by anthropologist Dina Freeman. And she joins me now. Morning.
Hi, Matt.
Just because this is one of these words which get bandied around a lot by politicians and journalists. But explain what we mean when we talk about globalisation.
Well, globalisation, indeed, is a term that gets used in lots of different ways and in very, very vaguely. At the most basic, it means the increasing interconnections between different people and different countries and the movement towards the formation of a more global society, rather than a society of different nation states, like an international system, but a global system that we would have one kind of global society. But there are different ways that we can organise globalisation, and that's very much what my book is looking at. Some of the problems of the ways that we currently organise globalisation and some suggestions of how we can do it better.
OK, let's stick with the problems first and then we'll do solutions. So what are the problems as you've identified them?
My book looks at the basic sort of structure of contemporary globalisation and sees that all of the problems really arising from one fundamental fact, which is that the economy is global while politics is national. And this sort of scale mismatch in the way that we've done contemporary globalisation really underlies many of our underlying problems, whether it's rising economic inequality or our inability to deal with climate change and COVID and various other things. But in contrast to much of the contemporary narrative, which is kind of saying, well, globalisation is bad and therefore the solution is nationalism, what I argue is that in today's sort of digitally connected world, there isn't really any going back to nationalism, really. And that what we need to do, what the real solution is to do globalization differently, fundamentally to get politics and economics at the same scale and to make sure that it's more democratic and more just. And I think it's really, really important because this view is currently lacking from the current debate at the moment. I heard you were just talking about the US election before I came on, and the US election is a fantastic example of the two narratives that are out there about globalization. Because we can look at the US election from the perspective that says it's a debate about two different views of how to structure globalization. You have Joe Biden wanting essentially contemporary globalization to continue more or less as it is. And you have Donald Trump wanting to move towards the nationalist option. And there are only these two options on the table, contemporary globalization or nationalism. But where is the voice calling for a third option, for a different kind of globalization, one that's more just and democratic? It's basically not there. No one is calling for this now. And yet this is exactly, I believe, what we need right now. So really what my book is trying to do is setting out this third option, explaining why we need it, and giving some possible models for a better globalization.
So how does that model work in practice? How would it look to a sort of normal person?
Well, my book doesn't come up with just one model. It looks at different kinds of models. To get it clearly, we need to understand what the actual problems are with this scale mismatch in the contemporary version that I've talked about.
Yeah.
And let me just give you an example. If we look at taxation, right, because here's an example where we can see the problems really, really clearly. And I think it's very topical and very important to people today. Globalization has brought about the globalization of production and the globalization of business. There are now thousands of transnational corporations, which are basically global businesses that operate all over the world. And yet there's no global regulator and no global tax system. Instead, you have individual countries trying to tax and regulate global corporations. And as we all know, it just doesn't work. Every week, we hear about new examples of how corporations are finding loopholes in the system to avoid paying tax and so on. And this is just happening. This is a great example of the mismatch between national governments trying to regulate global businesses.
So does that mean having essentially almost a global government, that we all collectively elect a body which would then oversee things like taxing international companies?
Well, that would be one option. And that's certainly one of the options that I talk about in my book. There are kind of other options as well. I mean, you could have a whole global government, but you could also have, for example, like if we carry on the example of taxation, you could have a global tax body, right? Instead of having all this sort of national systems. So if we had a global tax body at the same level as the global businesses and global economy, we would be able to tax transnational corporations as one business entity, which is what they actually are. We could close tax havens. We could make a universal system of taxation and indeed regulation that would apply to anyone, anywhere, and any business anywhere with no loopholes. And I really put it to you that this is the only way that we're going to get Google and Facebook and all the rest to actually pay their fair share of tax like the rest of us. And, now in this time of COVID, and the costs of the recovery and the costs of dealing with COVID. We've all heard Rishi Sunak talking about the need to increase taxation to pay for all these costs. If he does that within the current system that we have, the current world system, what that will mean effectively is that it's the middle classes and the working classes that are going to pay that extra tax, whereas the elites and the corporations will just move their money offshore and find a way to hide it. So we really do need a global tax system to sort out these problems. And taxation, of course, is just one example. We can look at debt. We can look at the ability to deal with climate change. We have so many issues and challenges that are global in nature, and yet we're trying to sort them out on a national level. I mean, it's just ridiculous, and it doesn't work.
But what about the fact that the public opinion seems to be moving in the opposite direction? You've got Britain leaving the EU. You've got in America, Donald Trump criticising NATO. You've got Russia and China basically blocking any action by the UN. That actually countries are moving further apart, both, the political leaders, but also electorates. That, given the option of whether or not to be part of a semi-global organisation, people in Britain voted to leave it. So who should be making the case the other way round?
Well, I think you're completely right, but it's back to what I said at the beginning, that the whole public narrative is just putting up these two polar opposites: globalization as it is now, or nationalism. And this is what the public is offered. And they have to choose between these two options, which frankly, neither of which are very appealing. And what I want to come and bring, and what my book says, is, there are other options. These are not the only two. And the option that I believe is the most important one is that we need to sort of change globalization to something that's more just and democratic. And I think if people hear this and have a chance to think about it and perhaps, read through some of the arguments and the analysis in my book, that they can come to appreciate that. Because the people that are against globalization and that, for example, voted for Brexit and that, vote for the US or want the US to pull out of the various global organizations, it's a kind of gut reaction that globalization is bad. And they're right. The current globalization is indeed bad for all the reasons that I've talked about and many, many more. But no one at the moment is putting this other alternative on the table. And that's what I want to do, because there are other alternatives. We've gone down the nationalism route before, right? We did that in the 1930s after the first period of globalization collapsed. And we all know that didn't very well. It ended in World War II, the Holocaust, and so on. So I really don't think that nationalism is the way to go now. So I want to promote this new idea of a different kind of globalization. I think people, if they think about it, can indeed come round to it.
Well, it's really good to speak to you. It's a fascinating discussion. Dina Freeman there talking about her new book, Can Globalization Succeed? We're going global next. We're going to the US.
Times Radio with Matt Chorely.